The hardest question any of us face is not the question of science and God, it's the question of suffering and God. Now, that's not our topic tonight, ladies and gentlemen, but you wanted me to say something briefly about it, do you? I come to North America frequently, and it's the question that comes up most often. We're faced with awful questions in our contemporary world. And the problem is that when you ask it, when it gets into the room, you realize, first of all, that there are two kinds of suffering. There's moral evil, the bad things people do to one another. And there's pain, cancers, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on, that we don't immediately blame other people on. And then there are two perspectives. There's the, well, let me put it this way. Cancer looks very different to a professor of oncology than it does to the young woman of 25 with 3 children who's just been told she's 6 months to live. And when this question comes up, there's an intellectual side and there's a pastoral side. And you've got to be aware of both. So very, very briefly, and this is hopelessly inadequate. So what I'm going to say now is this. I have a website, johnlennox.org. But if you Google my name in New Zealand, I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And I had to change every lecture, every TV interview, every radio interview, earthquake why. And somebody has put them all together and they're still there. And if you want to hear what I say in detail, but very briefly, it's this. I understand people that become atheists because of suffering. I've been to Auschwitz many times and I've wept every time. What do you say? But the atheist route has problems. Because if you say, well, that's just how the world is, Richard Dawkins does this. The world's just what you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's his view. But half a minute, if there's no good and no evil, why are you talking about the problem of evil and pain? Where do you get the concept of good and evil from if you deny the existence of God? And I want to go down that route because I spent a lot of time in Russia. And for many of my Russian friends, Dostoevsky was almost a prophet when he pointed out, if God doesn't exist, everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave well. Of course they can. I believe that all men and women are made in the image of God as moral beings, and of course they can behave. What he meant was there's no rational justification for morality if there's no God. Just as I believe, and I've explained to you tonight, why I think there's no rational justification for science if there's no God. This is a parallel thing. So the atheist view has huge problems. And of course, what does it solve? The one thing it doesn't solve is the pain or the evil, still there. So what do we do? Well, let me tell you very briefly what I do. We've all asked the question, surely if there's a good God who's all-powerful, there'd be no evil. So he can't be good or he can't be powerful. You've all heard that, haven't you? And you've all spent hours like I did as a student going through the night. Surely a good God would, could, might, should, all this kind of thing. Have any of you ever come to a satisfactory conclusion after that? No. Not one. I've never met one. Do you know why? It's very simple to see why. Because when we finish the discussion, we're faced with beauty and barbed wire in our world. Or beauty and bombs. It's a mixed picture. That's our problem. And any explanations that don't face that just don't wash. They don't work. So how do we cope with beauty and bombs? That's putting it very bluntly. But you know, if we don't face these things, we can't solve the problem of if God was this and this and this and this, then surely he would. The fact is, we got beauty and bombs. I'm a pure mathematician, and one of the few things I've learned from that is, if you can't solve one question, change the question. So here's my question. granted that it's beauty and bounds, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that there's a God that you could trust with it? Now that's a big question, ladies and gentlemen. I believe there is. See, at the heart of Christianity is not only a resurrection, but a cross. Now come with me. You might find this difficult, but I often say to audiences, look, at least listen to what Christianity says before you reject it. Like I listen and spent my life listening to atheists and Hindus and so on and so forth, arguing their case. At least listen. The claim is that the man on the cross was God incarnate. That's a colossal claim. But come with me. If he was, it raises a very deep question. What's God doing on a cross? Well, at the very least, and I've often sat beside people who are suffering intensely, and some of you may be right now, and said at least that tells us that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a window, ladies and gentlemen. That's a window, but it opens. Because if that were the end of the story, there'd be nothing more to be said. But the resurrection now tells us that death is not the end. And when the early Christian apostles went out into the world and preached the resurrection, one of the main points they made was, it guarantees there's going to be a final judgment. That's a marvelous thing. Justice will be done. The women and children that screamed their way into eternity in Auschwitz. Does God know about that? Of course he does. Now this is a huge issue, and I almost hesitate to compress it like this. But ladies and gentlemen, the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ now become a huge focus for something absolutely colossal. Not only does the cross mean that God has drawn near to us in our suffering, it's much deeper than that. If Christianity is true, Christ took upon himself all those things that cause suffering. All the mess that I've made in my life that's caused other people to suffer. And sometimes I thought it was wonderful. My snide remarks, my hate, my jealousy, and all this kind of stuff. He's taken them upon himself so that he can forgive me. Science has nothing to say about love. It's nothing to say about forgiveness. But the biggest thing that I need as a human being is forgiveness. Is there forgiveness? Human guilt is one of the biggest problems in the universe. Now, as I say, this isn't our topic for tonight, but you did ask me to say something about it. And what I would leave you with this. I do not know of any window into this hard question that bypasses the cross. But what I do know is that millions of people have stood at that cross, and by trusting Christ and receiving him into their lives, they've received new life. You know, so often at these meetings in science, people say at the end, and I'm finishing with this, they say, you know, you're a scientist. Aren't you an idiot, really? Because sitting there talking about Christianity, Christianity is not testable. Who told you that? Christianity is testable, ladies and gentlemen. You know, when you watch young people who are dependent on drugs or narcotics, and then you meet them 6 months later and they're free, and you say, what happened to you? Where's the radiance come from? Well, and this is the way they will put it. Well, actually, I found out about Jesus Christ and I trusted him and I got this new power, and I watched a TV program last Sunday, I think it was, at home. And it was about narcotic dependence and older people and this house that looked after them run by Christians. And somebody said, what does this house mean to you? And the man said, you see that door into the house? I walked through there and I got saved. Saved in the sense of his life saved and made meaningful. Why? Because they told him about Christ. You see, as you see, I'm pretty old. I'm probably pretty near the end of my life. But I have seen again and again and again and again and again transformation in life. And when you see 2 and 2 make 4 thousands of times, you begin to believe that 2 and 2 make 4. What's it got to do with? It's got to do with Christ. That's the evidence. If that wasn't there, I would quit. But it is there. And I've lived with Christ for over 60 years. And in my family and with my wife, we've put it to the test again and again. Now you say that's all subjective, but in the end, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. If there was no evidence of that kind, there would be absolutely no reason to believe.